Hey, good evening, good afternoon, everybody. This your girl Tiffany coming through here live in effect. Today, I'm going to be dealing with a topic about John Conyers Jr., who was a U.S. representative from Michigan. He based out of Detroit, but he was a U.S. representative from Michigan. He ran in the House of Representatives from 1965 to 2017. So he was born on May 16th of 1929 in Detroit, and he passed away on October the 20th, I believe, or the 19th of 2019 in Detroit, Michigan. So the reason why I wanted to talk about this man, because he was one of the first U.S. representative to introduce the bill, which is the H.R. 40 bill. So if many of you don't know about the H.R. 40 bill, I will get into that. However, this man played a role in that. So him along with NCOBRA, right, which is the National Organization Coalition for Black Reparation, etc. NCOBRA have worked together along with this man to put out the H.R. 40 bill. And then, the topic about reparation been going on for a long time, for years or whatnot. And this bill been out since 1989. So it's still ongoing discussion, debate about it. And I don't think it should be any type of debate because, we should get compensated for our ancestors who have struggled so hard in this country, and they was promised an opportunity. Again, 40 acres and a mule, and many of them have not seen 40 acres and a mule. A lot of them did not receive that. There was those of them that died in poverty. So, for me, I believe that it will create generational wealth. It will help to enhance the income of African American families. I also believe that there should be a discount, right, when it comes to health insurance regarding to African Americans. Because all the other ethnic groups get it. The Native American got it. The people who are from Alaska, they receive it. The Pacific Islanders, they got that, but African Americans not getting any type of discount or, affordable health care, which to me is not fair because we have dealt with a lot of things here. So at least that should be something that we should be able to get or receive. But you know how this goes. Anyways, that's just the way that this government, the system has created, to make it where there are only certain groups who benefit, who reaps the benefit, while the rest don't. So anyhow, let's go into the information about John Conyers. That's a picture of John Conyers when he was young. Then I'm going to show you the last photo. So that's John Conyers later on in his life. All right, so who was John Conyers? So let's go down to his early life, education, history. Okay. So he was born and raised in Detroit, the son of Lucille Janice Simpson and John James Conyers, a labor leader. Among his siblings, Among his siblings was younger brother William Conyers after graduating from Northwestern High School. Conyers served in the Michigan National Guard from 1948 to 1950, the U.S. Army from 1950 to 1954, and the U.S. Army Reserve from 1954 to 1957. Conyers served for a year in Korea during the Korean War as an officer in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and was awarded combat and merit citation. So how did he end up in the U.S. House of Representatives? We're gonna get to that part. So after his active military service, Conyers pursued a college education. He earned both his BA in 1957 and LLB in 1958 degrees from Wayne State University. After he was admitted to the bar, he worked on the staff of Congressman John Dingell. He also served as counsel to several Detroit area labor union locals. From 1961 to 1963, he was a referee for Michigan Workmen's Compensation Department. And Conyers became one of the leaders of the civil rights movement. He was present in Selma, Alabama on October 7, 1963 for the voter registration drive known as Freedom Day. All right, so let's look at how he got into the representative. So the election. In 1964, Conyers ran for an open seat in what was then the 1st District and defeated Republican Robert Blackwell with 84% of the vote. He was reelected 13 times with even larger margins. After the 1990 United States Census, Michigan lost a congressional district and there was redistricting. Conyers' district was renumbered as the 14th District. In 1992, Conyers won re-election to his 15th term in his new district, which included western suburbs of Detroit with 82% of the vote against Republican nominee John Gordon. He won re-election another 9 times after that. His worst re-election performance was in 2010 when he got 77% of the vote against the Republican nominee Don Ukrainic. In 2013, his district was renamed as the 13th District. In total, Conyers won re-election 25 times and was serving his 26th term. He was the Dean of the House as longest serving current member, the 3rd longest serving member of the House in history, and the 6th longest serving member of Congress in history. He was the 2nd longest serving member of either House of Congress in Michigan's history, trailing only his former boss, Dingell. He was also the last member of the largest Democratic freshman class of 1964 who was still serving in the House. In May of 2014, Wayne County Clerk Kathy Garrett determined that Conyers had not submitted enough valid nominating petition signature to appear on the August 2014 primary election ballot. 2 of his workers circulating petitions were not themselves registered voters at the time, which was required under Michigan law. But on May 23rd, federal district judge Matthew Lintman issued an injunction placing Conyers back on the ballot, ruling that the requirement that circulators be registered voters was similar to an Ohio law which had been found unconstitutional in 2008 by a federal appeals court. The Michigan Secretary of State's office subsequently announced they would not appeal the ruling. So let's look at the tenure. So tenure means how long a person's been around, etc. So Conyers was one of the 13 founding members of the Congressional Black Caucus and was considered the dean of that group. Formed in 1969, the CBC was founded to strengthen African-American lawmakers' ability to address the legislative concern of Black and minority citizens. He served longer in Congress than any other African-American. In 1971, he was one of the originals of Nixons Enemies list. I'm curious. Let's look that up. Let's see. Nixon Enemy list. So Nixon Enemy list is the informal name of what started as a list of President of the United States Richard Nixon major political opponents, compiled by Charles Colson, written by George T. Bell, and sent in memorandum form to John Dean on September the 9th, 1971. This list was part of a campaign officially known as Opponent List and Political Enemies Project. The list became public knowledge on June 27, 1973, when Dean mentioned during hearings with the Senate Watergate committees that a list existed containing those whom the president did not like. Journalist Daniel Scar, who happened to be on the list, managed to obtain a copy of it later that day. A longer second list was made public by Dean on December 20, 1973, during a hearing with the Congressional Joint Committee on Internal Revenue Taxation. So therefore, President Nixon had a list of those who he did not like, or who he felt that was his enemy. And one of those to be his enemy was John Conyers Jr. Of course, we all can look at that from a racial standpoint, because at the time, Richard Nixon was very racist. He was very prejudiced towards black people. So, of course, it would be no surprise that he saw a black man as his enemy, because let's keep it real, most white people, especially white men, they feel intimidated when they see black men in position of power. It gives them some form of intimidation. They don't like that. They feel like, oh, that means we have to stoop down to the level. We have to look up to this nigger, this minority, as the head figure. So many of them don't like that. Many of them have a problem with seeing black people in position of power, especially black men. It was a problem for Nixon. So it was no surprise that he felt some kind of way about John Conyers. All right, so let's go down. In 1965, Conyers won a seat as a freshman on the influential Judiciary Committee, which was then chaired by Democratic Congressman Emanuel Seller of New York. The assignment was considered an elite one, as judiciary ranked behind only Ways and Means and Appropriation in terms of the number of members who sought assignment there. According to the National Journal, Conyers has been considered with Pete Stark, John Lewis, Jim McDermott, and Barbara Lee to be one of the most liberal members of Congress for many years. Rosa Parks, known for her prominent role in the Montgomery, Alabama boycott, moved to Detroit and served on Conyers' staff between 1965 and 1988. Well, that part I did not even know. All right. So Conyers was known to have opposed regulation of online gambling. He opposed the Unlawful Internet Gambling Enforcement Act of 2006. After the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968, Conyers introduced the first bill in Congress to make King's birthday a federal holiday. So he introduced the first bill of Dr. King's birthday. He continued to propose legislation to establish the federal holiday in every session of Congress from 1968 to 1983, when Martin Luther King Jr. Day was finally signed into law by President Ronald Reagan. In 1983, he joined with 7 other congressional representatives to sponsor a resolution to impeach Ronald Reagan over his sudden and unexpected invasion of Grenada. Conyers introduced the Commission to Study Reparation Proposal for African Americans Act, H.R. 3745, in January 1989. He reintroduced this bill each congressional term. It calls for establishing a commission to research the history of slavery in the United States and its effect on current society, which is to recommend ways to remedy this injustice against African Americans. The current version was introduced on and referred to committee on January the 3rd, 2013. Conyers first introduced the proposed resolution in 1989 and has stated his intention to annually propose this act until it is approved and passed. Since 1997, the bill has been designated H.R. 40 bill, most recently H.R. 40 annulling to the promise of 40 acres and a mule. If passed, the commission would explore the long-standing effect of slavery on today's society, politics, and economics. And it goes on to quote, my bill does four things. It acknowledges the fundamental injustice and inhumanity of slavery. It establishes a commission to study slavery, its subsequent racial and economic discrimination against freed slaves. It studies the impact of those forces on today's living African American, and the commission will then make a recommendation to Congress on appropriate remedies to redress the harm inflicted on living African Americans. So this is why it was important to talk about him. He introduced the bill for H.R. 40, and not only that, he also introduced the bill for Dr. King's birthday in 1968. That was him. So have John Conyers not introduced that H.R. 40 bill, we would not be sitting here talking about reparation today. We would not be sitting up here fighting for reparation. The ADOS movement wouldn't be talking about reparation. FBA wouldn't be talking about reparation, because it goes back to John Conyers. He was the one that introduced that bill, along with NCOBRA. So that's why the bill is still at a standstill, because of him, because he introduced it every year. Every time he got elected, he always talked about the H.R. 40 bill. All right. So, all right, let's go ahead. Let's skip down just a little bit. All right, ethics controversy. In April of 2006, the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office sent independent letters to the House Ethics Committee saying two former aides of Conyers had alleged that Conyers used his staff to work on several local and state campaigns of other politicians, including his wife, for the Detroit City Council. She won a seat in 2005. He also forced them to babysit and chauffeur his children. In late of December 2006, Conyers accepted responsibility for violating House rules. A statement issued December 29th of 2006 by the House Ethics Committee Chairman Doc Hastings and ranking minority member Howard Berman said Conyers acknowledged what he characterized as a lack of clarity in his communication with staff members regarding their official duties and responsibility, and accepting responsibility for his action. All right, and then there's the one about the copyright bill. So Conyers repeatedly introduced a Fair Copyright and Research Works Act, a bill that will overturn the NIH public access policy and open access mandated for National Institutes of Health. Conyers' bill will forbid the government from mandating that federally funded research be made freely available to the public. The legislation was supported by the publishing industry and opposed by groups such as Electronic Frontier Foundation. Writers Lawrence Lessing and Michael Eisen accused Conyers of being influenced by publishing houses who have contributed significant money to his campaign. So let's look at the copyright, Fair Copyright and Research Works Act. Okay, so it says, also known as the Conyers Bill, was submitted as a direct response to the National Institute of Health public access policy intending to reverse it. The bill alternate names relates it to U.S. Representative John Conyers, who introduced it at the 111th United States Congress on February the 3rd, 2009. The initiative of the bill is to amend Title 17 of the United States Code with respect to works associated with specific funding agreements. It will ultimately prohibit federal agency from placing any condition for copyright transfer on funding agreements, effectively making the current NIH policy illegal. All right, so it says the code will be amended by way of adding limitation on the federal government with regard to funding agreements. A contract, grant, or other agreement entered in between a federal agency and any person under which funds are provided by a federal agency in whole or in part for the performance of experimental, developmental, or research activities. All right, so basically, he put out this bill to protect the rights and the works of those in the medical field that has done a certain research project, basically. So that was his reason for pulling out this whole policy or this bill to protect, the rights of those in the research field. So that's why if you go on a certain website, you can't get access to certain information. You can't get access to different sources unless you pay for it, because some stuff is like not really public access. So it's like some things you'll see like the introduction or you'll see the abstract of it, but you're not going to be able to gain access with everything unless there is permission from those who are the researchers and those who have worked on a specific project, if they want their information to be access to the public. But if they don't want their information to be access to the public, then they have the right to do so. So yeah. All right, cool. Anyways, now I'm gonna skip it all the way down to his life. So Conyers married Monica Esther, a teacher in Detroit, in 1990. She was 25 and he was 61. They had two sons together, John James III and Carl Edward Conyers. She later served as a vice administrator of the public schools in 2005 was elected to the Detroit City Council. In December of 2015, Monica Conyers filed for divorce, citing breakdown of the marriage. However, they reconciled in the late 2016. So Conyers' great nephew, Ian Conyers, was elected to the Michigan Senate in 2016. He generated controversy by telling of Conyers' planned retirement in interviews before the congressman announced it himself and claiming his great uncle's endorsement. While Ian Conyers announced he will run in a special election for the congressman's seat, John Conyers endorsed his son. John Conyers III chose not to run. Ian Conyers was defeated in the Democratic primary by Rashida Tlaib. John Conyers died on October 27, 2019 at his home in Detroit. He was 90 years old. His funeral was held on November the 4th at Detroit's Greater Grace Temple. All right, so as you can see, this is all his representation. And he has a lot of honors and awards. So if you guys want to look up more, you can go down here where it says notes and reference. You can find all the sources that coincide with this article on Wikipedia. And you can also look at the external links as well. So I have two other sources that I want to present. Well, actually, three sources. So John Conyers wrote an article called Toward Black Political Empowerment, Can the System Be Transformed? So let me show you guys that. All right, so right down here, It was written in 1984. Well, no, actually, it was written in 1975. Sorry. So yeah, it says reprinted from volume 7, number 2, October 1975. Towards black political empowerment, can the system be transformed? So right here, let me start off reading this first uh first passage. So the first passage says, although a little slow in coming as compared to 1971, the wacky season is about to begin. Presidential candidates will shortly commence the hunting and fishing season for delegates and supporters, and once more black Americans will be called on individually and collectively to assess their role in the national electoral process. Clearly, we cannot afford to bypass the political struggle, but where and on what terms should we join? For better and worse, things are different this year. Across the country, the inner cities are worse off than they were before the Great Society programs were launched. There are more jobless and impoverished among us today than there were 4 years ago. But all is not dim. There is more wealth at the top and more Swiss banks account than ever before. Cadillacs and private yachts have been experiencing boom sales, but before surrendering to exuberance, let it also be noted that crime has been running rampant, even more so in suites than in the streets. Day to day, the closure of government lawlessness have revealed the existence of a quasi police state. To live under a government at the Watergate, if not the watershed, and not know of its crimes and corruption is worlds apart from knowing what to do with a government thus exposed. The economy is in shambles, and despite the perennial optimism of administration, crystal ball glazer, it will probably continue to deteriorate. Accustomed as we are to pervasive unemployment, many are caught for the first time in a variation of the old one, two, and an economy brought to its knees by depression and then given the knockout punch of inflation. More and more of the censorship feel that the multinationals and conglomerates have more influence over government other than or then the other way around. As a result, politicians who, as a group, have generally been held in low self-esteem or low esteem are now forced to compete with big business executives for the public's disaffection. What is plainly bothering people is that they know the government isn't working. They are ready for fundamental change. There remains one problem: who will initiate it and how? And I'm just going to stop there. So if you guys want to look this up, you can go on tnfonline.com, which stands for Taylor and Francis Group. So tnfonline.com. And under here, you'll find Black Scholar, Journal of Black Studies and Research. Okay. All right, so Human Right Brief, Legislative Focus, Reparation for African Americans by Natasha Parajiman. Oh, I think was it Natasha Parajiman Concepcion, however you say it. I don't know how you say the last name, but anyways. Legislative Focus, Reparation for African Americans. Now, here's the introduction. The issue of paying reparation to descendants of African slaves has African American slaves has been a controversial one within the United States. As reported in Volume 7, Issue 3 of the Human Rights Brief, Professor Adrian Davis, a member of the Reparation Litigation Committee established by the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparation in America, noted the reparation movement is well over a century old. The most current manifestation of the reparation effort regained its momentum in 1960 during the Civil Rights Movement and subsequently in the 1980s, when the United States government paid millions of dollars to American Indian tribes and Japanese Americans who had been forced to live in internment camps during World War II. To date, however, the United States government has failed to address the idea of paying reparations to African Americans for slave labor that took place in the United States for more than 2 centuries. The realization that slavery stigmatized and exploited millions of African Americans, nevertheless, is a proponent idea that has gained support over the years. In Cobra, which recently held its 11th annual conference on reparation, and the reparation assessment group, for example, have both been established in recent years to work toward and to promote the idea of reparation for African Americans. And COBRA is an umbrella organization whose primary objective is to promote the idea of reparation for descendants of African American slaves. Beginning in 1989, and COBRA made its first breakthrough in Congress. Every year since 1989, Representative John Conyers Jr. has been sponsor of H.R. 40. The bill has 3 fundamental components. It acknowledges the fundamental injustice, cruelty, brutality, and inhumanity of slavery in the United States, establishes a commission to study the impacts of slavery and the subsequent racial and economic discrimination against African Americans, and authorize the commission to make recommendations to Congress on the appropriate remedies. The bill number 40 intentionally remains the same each year. The bill is reintroduced in Congress because it is symbolic of the 40 acres and a mule that freed slaves were originally promised in 1860s, but which many never received. Unfortunately, H.R. 40 in its various forms has not received overwhelming support. For example, when it was initially introduced in 1993, the bill received only 28 co-sponsors. As Professor Davis noted in her article, only 10 of these co-sponsors were not Black. This response in Congress only serves to underline the fact that the U.S. government remains opposed to the idea of reparation, or at the very least is unwilling to entertain the idea in the near future. That's interesting, because still to this day, there's still not enough people who are addressing the H.R. 40 bill. And they just had another conference about the H.R. 40 sometime this year. I think it was around April. But, you didn't hear much about the president, the current president that we have, Joe Biden. He didn't address much about reparation. I guess it's not his primary focus because of the pandemic. Now, I get that you're focusing on the pandemic, but, the reparation, come on. And Kamala Harris claimed to be the Black woman that she is, and she proud of being Black, you know what I'm saying? You claim it, but you're not speaking much about reparation, but you want to tell us that America was not built off of racism. You want to convince us of that, you and Joe Biden both. I just, But what more do you expect from these politicians? Matter of fact, let me play the video real fast. Let me pull up the video about the whole HR 40 conference that took place this year. All right, so I'm going to play a little bit of the video, and there's going to be some like technical difficulty in the beginning because they trying to get everything organized, set up. But I'm gonna play probably about 10 minutes of this video.
Made up of representation of people. The enslavement of people of African American descent in America was started before we were a country in 1619 and has gone on for through the end of the Civil War. The effects this has had, this has been a crime against humanity, and the effects it's had on our society and on African Americans in general continue to cause difficulties for people in America. Everything from racial inequality, economic opportunities, which have been manifest, and disparate health outcomes, which have been so sad and come to much light recently, but gone on for centuries, and to the plague of unjustified police violence against Black Americans. Slavery was our nation's original sin. Our Constitution protected it, embodying various compromises that gave disproportionate power to slave states. For example, the 3/5 clause, which we always hear about, counted a slave as 3/5 of a person for population counts, which in turn gave disproportionate representation to slave states in the House of Representatives, and accordingly in the Electoral College, which was created as a way to elect a president. And that gave slave states another avenue to exercise disproportionate influence over national affairs. In essence, slaves counted for 3/5 toward the representation in Congress and the Electoral College, but it gave slaves nothing. It gave their masters something, and it gave them more power. And so it was not, Congress wasn't made up of representation of people who had rights and who were free people. It was representative of, in the South, of people who didn't. And it was a compromise that stained our Constitution. It is only fitting then that in the midst of a continuing reckoning over police treatment of Black people in a pandemic that has disproportionately impacted Black Americans, that we should hold this hearing today on HR 40, the Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals for African Americans Act. Our colleague, Representative Sheila Jackson Lee, who's a member of the subcommittee, is the current lead sponsor of this legislation. I'm proud to be and have been an original co-sponsor ever since I came to Congress in 2007. Chairman Nadler's with us, who's also a longtime co-sponsor of the bill. The greatest credit for HR 40 belongs really to two individuals. First and foremost, our former colleague and the former chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, my friend, my mentor, and my political father when I came to Congress, the late John Conyers Jr. He first introduced this legislation over 30 years ago and reintroduced it every Congress thereafter until his retirement. He named it HR 40 for the promise that was given slaves after the Civil War for having 40 acres and a mule. And that's where HR 40 came from. John Conyers was a great man and a great leader, and it's properly remembered here today. The second individual most responsible for HR 40 is unfortunately one of the most despised characters in American history, John Wilkes Booth. You know, why John Wilkes Booth? Because when he assassinated Abraham Lincoln, that led to Andrew Johnson becoming the president of the United States. And President Johnson effectively rescinded the promise made by General William Tecumseh Sherman to former slaves that they would each be guaranteed that 40 acres of land and that mule, that each person they become free as free persons a promise that colloquially referred to as 40 acres and a mule. That ended with the assassination of President Lincoln, and it really started off serious problems in our country and shortchanged the newly freed Americans. H.R. 40 would create a commission to study the history of slavery in America, the role of the federal and state governments in supporting slavery and racial discrimination, other forms of discrimination against the descendants of slaves, and the lingering effects of slavery on African Americans. The commission would also make recommendations as to appropriate ways to educate the American public about its findings and appropriate remedies in light of those findings. And I want to digress for a minute and mention a hearing we had. It might have been the first full hearing we had on H.R. 40 back in about 2007 or 2008. One of our witnesses was Charles Ogletree, one of the giants in the courtroom and with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He said at that time, H.R. 40 was a study of reparations. It may not be the 21st century equivalent of 40 acres and a mule, and the 21st century equivalent, he said, was an SUV and a condo. He said it might be gigantic programs to help people, particularly African Americans, but others who have been disproportionately affected in healthcare. Thank our witnesses for being here today and look forward to their testimony. At this point in our hearing, we normally recognize the ranking member. The ranking member is Mr. Johnson, but today Mr. Burgess Owens, new member from the state of Utah, I believe will serve as ranking member, and I will recognize Mr. Owens for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On June 19th, 2019, I was honored to testify before this committee as a witness for the hearing on the H.R. 40 and the path of restoration of justice. Little did I know that a little less than 2 years later, I would once again participate in this hearing of this subcommittee, this time as a member. I want to thank the ranking member Johnson for the honor of acting as ranking member for this hearing. And once again, thank Chairman Cohen, my fellow committee members and invited guests for this opportunity to share my story with you today. Before I share my story, let me emphasize 3 points to help guide us through our discussion. First, let me reiterate that slavery was and still is an evil, whether it be the 83-year history of our nation or prior 3,000-year history or the presence around the world today. Incompatible with American ideals, we purge the stain from our nation's soul at the cost of 600,000 American lives. I'm a product of that evil practice. My great-great-grandfather Silas arrived here in the belly of a slave ship, sold to the Burgess plantation. He escaped through the Underground Railroad and died a successful entrepreneur. Built the first Black church, elementary, purchased 102 acres of farmland that he paid off in 2 years. Second, reparations is not the way to right our country's wrong. What I propose later will be more lasting. Third, it is impractical and a non-starter for the United States government to pay reparations. It is also unfair and heartless to give Black Americans the hope that this is a reality. The reality is that Black American history is not one of a hapless, hopeless race oppressed by a more powerful white race. It is instead a history of millions of middle and wealthy class Black Americans throughout the early 20th century achieving their American dream. We're discussing this morning the theory of reparation. It's nothing new. It's been tried over the last 100 years.
All right. So that was the hearing that took place earlier this year in 2021 about reparation. I wasn't interested in watching the whole entire video because just certain people that's on that panel in itself don't need to be on the panel. Certain people just don't need to be on that panel to be speaking about reparation. They're not qualified. So that's why, because after watching it, I think it was last year sometime. Either it was last year or year before last. It was a disaster. It was a disaster last year. They had Danny Glove on there, Tanishi Coates, and someone else, and 2 other people on there. And it just became a disaster. It was a hot mess to me. I'm just being frankly honest. So I don't have no interest in looking at this one because this one is going to be a hot mess as well because you have certain people that's on the panel that's speaking that don't need to speak. So that's one of the reasons why we not getting reparation, because you got these black folks telling us that we don't, that reparation should not be the way to combat the issue. It should not be the way. That goes to show how oblivious and ignorant they are of their history, and they're trying to kiss the ass of the party they belong to, which is the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. So yeah, but anyways, that's all the video for today about John Conyers Jr. This yesterday was his birthday, May 16th. So may he rest in peace. And I want to thank him for introducing the HR 40 bill to the Congress, because I know he put up a lot of fight for that, and he did. So I want to thank him for it. And I also want to thank him for also introducing the bill for Martin Luther King's Day, because that was needed. I like to thank him for that too. But anyways, ladies and gentlemen, you all have a good one, and I hope you all enjoy yourselves. So thank you to the new subscribers out there that have been subscribing to my channel, watching my channel. Thanks to those who've been sharing the videos and checking out the contents. Until next time, peace and power, elevation be to all of you. And it's your girl, Tiffany. I'm out.